The time is now 29 minutes past 5 p.m. Central African Time. Welcome back. You are tuned into Salam Media. It is the weekend edition of the Iftar Drive with myself, Saeed Jadwit. We are your Ramadan companion as we count down to the breaking of our fasts. Just a quick reminder of your Iftar times this evening in Johannesburg, 36 minutes past 6 p.m. In Durban, 26 minutes past 6 p.m. In Port Elizabeth, 10 to 7, and Cape Town, 19 minutes past 7. So wherever you're listening to us from, get those iftar and water ready. Maghrib is approaching. Now for our main conversation, South Africa's digital ID rollout. Promise or peril? The government is gearing up to launch a national digital identity system this year. It promises easier, fraud-resistant access to services, greater inclusion and efficiency through the My Mzansi platform. Yet in a country with a deep history of state control and surveillance, many are asking, what are the real costs to privacy and freedom? We're honored to be joined by Professor Keith Breckenridge, a historian at the University of the Witwatersrand. He's also the author of the acclaimed book Biometric State, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa, from 1850 to the present. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us this afternoon. Welcome to Salam Media.
Thank you, Saeed. Ramadan Mubarak to you and to your guests and to the listeners. Thank you very much.
All right. Professor, to start us off, your book, Biometric State, it traces the long history of identification and surveillance in South Africa. Could you share what first drew you to this topic and the key insight from the book that stands out to you most today?
Okay. What drew me to this? I did my PhD on the mining industry, on the gold mining industry, and fingerprinting was a really very important part of how the early gold mining industry basically developed the labor relations, the control over the workers. And truthfully, the really important moment is when the British decide to import in 1902. They brought 60,000 Chinese workers into the country and had tremendous, you can imagine, anxiety about how they were going to track those people and police them and pay them and lend them money, all of the things that you need ID for. So they tried doing it with photographs. And that didn't work very well. And then they moved to fingerprinting. And of course, it came to South Africa from India. It had been used in Bengal in the 1880s, in fact, in the 1860s. And the British imperial officials brought it here. So I came across fingerprinting very early, long before apartheid, 50 years before apartheid, when the British were experimenting with it. And it is true that the apartheid state used fingerprinting for Africans very early, from the early 50s, and then for everybody from the 1980s. So you know this, so we all were basically subject to fingerprinting from the 80s. But that doesn't mean that the ID system that Home Affairs is planning to use now is necessarily bad. There's very, very few countries in the world that don't have digital ID in some form.
Now, building on that historical foundation, the government has announced plans to launch a digital ID system. And I'm just wondering, how do you see this latest development fitting in with the broader patterns of biometric governance that you've documented?
Yeah,
since?
so I mean, if you've lived in South Africa for more than a week, you know how obsessed we are with biometric ID. So we've had a digital ID, truly a working digital ID system and integrated biometric identification longer actually than anybody. The first properly developed one is the one that is developed here. There are others. There's one in Malaysia, there's one in Pakistan, NADRA have got one very similar to ours. And then the absolutely critical thing that happens globally is Aadhaar, the development of a single biometric database for the whole of the Indian population, which starts around 2008, 2009, and by 2015 has really, scaled incredibly. I mean, truly astonishingly, to cover the whole of the Indian population. So if you ask me, what do I think about? I think our system could be much better than it is, and there are other systems that are similar to what we have that work a lot better. A lot of the problem in South Africa has to do with the two ways of looking at this. It has to do with the fact that Home Affairs has had a 20-year run of really poor relationships with what we will call a primary IT contractor. So that was Gijima AST around 2010, and then much more recently it was EOH. And Zaid, if you know anything about both of them basically fell out with Home Affairs and were accused of incompetence and corruption. In other words, bribing people to get the contracts. And that has been a much bigger problem. So that's, if you ask me, what the risks are with digital ID, I think the fundamental risk is the state thinking it can do all of this work by itself, which is a kind of chronic problem in South Africa. If you compare digital ID in other countries, say India, for example, or Britain, my favorite one is in Britain. In Britain, they have a digital ID system, but it's not run by the government. It's run by Experian and by Adobe, and a whole lot of firms basically are contracted by the state to provide people with ID. And that also comes with risks, but they're different risks than the ones we face, where we have a big, powerful database that is very, very opaque. It's governed in a very opaque way. So if you in South Africa and something bad happens to your ID, it's very hard to find information from Home Affairs about what the problem is. And it's even harder to get some kind of intermediary who will act on your behalf to solve the problem. For example, a lawyer, or your employer, or your political party, any of those things, very hard to get because there's a suspicion between the department and the people who run the database and the society, and this real suspicion of intermediaries. But intermediaries are a very important part of how these systems work in many, many other places. In almost all other countries, intermediaries are important. Sometimes it's local government. Sometimes it's like it could be your bank, or it could be a religious organization. All of these things actually play, tribal organizations, they all play important parts in helping people solve the problems of building up a big, powerful ID system.
I'm sure we'll get a chance to discuss the pros and cons of a digital ID system. But before we get there, I'd like for you to maybe just give the listeners at home who are listening via the radio, and then those, of course, who are watching on the various platforms, YouTube and Facebook, some sort of idea as to what changes once a digital ID system is implemented. I know you mentioned we have a smart ID at the moment. So once the digital ID comes around, what changes?
Well, the best way to look at this is to look at the other. I think that they're trying to model it. Unfortunately, they're modeling it on two completely different countries. The one is Estonia, which hardly has any people in it at all. There are only 1.5 million Estonians, and so they've built a very sophisticated digital ID system, which is laced into everything. You interact with the state entirely, really, through a browser. You don't have to think about going to queue at Home Affairs. You can do all of that without having to physically actually go and do anything. And then the other one, which probably is much closer to us, is Aadhaar, and in particular what people call India Stack. The layers, they start with the ID, and then you build up all the other services on top of that. So you could theoretically, interact on one platform. If you wanted to, you could call your VAT data out of SARS, give permission to another service provider to access that data, and then use that data as the basis for accessing credit from somebody who's interested in lending money to small businesses. In theory, that's what should happen. So you could have a much stronger and more integrated national economy built up around these the ID. But it's important to keep in mind the distinction in Estonia. It's not a biometric system. It doesn't require you to authenticate biometrically, whereas Aadhaar, everything is authenticated all the time. So if you want, it's a bit like if you've ever applied for credit at a bank or a phone contract. That's the point in South Africa when you authenticate. So you put your fingerprint on the system, and Aadhaar, we're authenticating all the time. So you're either authenticating on an app on your phone that looks up your ID on the database, the government's database, or you're another service provider is doing that. And there are all these, Aadhaar has built these clever ways of not exposing your ID number. So you can basically provide what they call a token. You can provide a temporary string that will authenticate transactions. You don't have to be completely exposed, and it's very sophisticated. It's not. I don't think privacy is a very useful way of thinking about what the risks are in a problem in a system like this. The privacy risks are already there in South Africa, and they're 100 different things. Probably the most important one, and the one that's actually already been hacked and dumped on the internet, is the credit history system, where credit reporting is all centralized. That information is extremely revealing. These ID systems are much less, I think, exposing of people's privacy than many of the other commercial systems that already exist. So, I think the problem, Zahid, is that the digital ID project in South Africa wants to build everything out from an app on your phone. So in theory, you won't need to go and queue at your licensing department in order to get but I think the chances of that happening in my lifetime are very low, because the departments are very territorial and they don't want to give up the little bits of money that they earn from driving us mad and making us queue. So the easy way to answer your question is a digital ID will mean everything is on your phone, everything's on an app. In practice, I think what we're going to get is you'll see what's on the app, and it'll tell you. What really worries me is that it'll reveal essentially the need for correction. It'll show you that your address is wrong. Almost everybody's address is wrong. Names are misspelt. You're married to the wrong person. Your car's VIN is incorrect. All of this data is going to suddenly be visible. And I don't think it's going to be very easy for you to actually fix it in the real world. So the promise of the digital ID is, you're going to basically have this kind of seamless, well-integrated, error-free platform, whereas in practice, what it's going to be is something like the opposite. I'm sorry to say this. I don't mean to discourage the people who are doing this. I think they're trying to do something really important, but they don't really want to embrace or think about what information really looks like in South Africa. And you can see, do this. Go online, look at your eNatus data. Go and look at what the government thinks you owe in fines, where they think you live. Very few of these databases are in a good shape. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about integrating them. But when we do that integration, we really need to think about who the people are who are going to help us fix the mistakes. Because error correction is going to be the fundamental problem. And this has been true. It's the whole history. It's all the way back to 1900. The real problem is how do you get the problems fixed? How do you get mistakes fixed? I think we can do that. And there are, capacious, competent institutions that can help us fix a lot of that information. But, even schools could do some of it. So if you've got, and you could probably need a scoring system where a school, demonstrates that it has this capacity. It can interact with the database and fix it. My favorite example, I always use this, is undertakers, the people who put people in the ground after they're dead. Undertakers can solve home affairs problems much more efficiently than anybody else. And that's a lot to do with the economy around burial. So there's a lot of money in that economy. Families are all prepared to spend quite a lot of money. And the undertakers are compelled to get the certificate, the death certificate, before they can actually charge you any money. So they're actually acting as intermediaries to help families solve a lot of these problems, even around things like, what is the name of the deceased? What is the official name of the deceased? It's the undertaker who actually really solves that problem. He'll talk to all the people in the family, try and find out what's the ID number. Okay, well, Home Affairs calls him X. That's what's got to go on the death certificate. And they work very well to essentially help solve those problems. But we're very suspicious of those kinds of intermediaries in South Africa. We constantly think they're bribing and corrupting the officials. And that makes it much harder for us to fix these broken databases than it really should be. Just think about the eNatus example. If your VIN is wrong, if there's a digit incorrectly captured, that makes you vulnerable to every traffic policeman in the country. It's very hard to fix. You want to go and get it fixed, you've got to go and queue at and that means essentially the state it's like a hidden tax that's making your life much more difficult. And until we start talking about fixing all of those problems, we really, we shouldn't imagine that the digital ID is going to make anyone's lives better. All right, you'll see I'm insisting again, Zaid, that privacy is not the lens we want to use to understand this. Privacy comes from the late 20th century. It's, basically a European problem. It's a way in which people think about, their privilege, really. Our situation is much more, we live in a society that does a very poor job of distributing resources to people, and it does a very poor job of tracking the resources that it does distribute. And that makes everybody's lives much more difficult than it should be. And we need a way of fixing that.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for giving us that historical background and also some insight into how this operates and how you expect it might operate. Time is now 5:45. We do have to take a quick ad break. And when we come back, I'm hoping we'll be able to get into some of those pros and cons of having a digital ID system. I think you have touched a bit on that in your last few comments, but we'll get into that a bit deeper and then we'll wrap up. Please do stay with us.
With Ashraful Aid this Ramadan, your zakat changes lives. It feeds families facing hunger, restores dignity to those in need, and brings hope where it is needed most. From food relief to essential support, your zakah reaches communities with care, transparency, and impact. Give with confidence, give with trust. Make your zakah count this Ramadan. Give your zakah to Ashraful Aid and help change lives today.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Al Bayt Lodge, your true home away from home. Al Bayt is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities. Conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities, your stay will be truly unforgettable as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Al Bayt has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albaytlodge.co.za.
This Ramadan, please consider donating to the Islamic Dawah movement. For over 45 years, IRIM has built over 80 masjids and distributed more than 160,000 Qurans in 8 local languages. IRIM has installed over 250 boreholes and water wells. Over 1,000 children are fed daily, building strong Muslim communities in disadvantaged areas.
World-class financial services only at Sapphire Global, your financial partner. If you are looking for Islamic Sharia and ethical financial products, look no further. Sapphire Global offers a wide range of financial service offerings from short-term to life and investments. A full-service center with all financial requirements under one brand. Our highly skilled and experienced consultants are ready to help protect your financial future. Contact us on 041 001 0184 or visit our website on www.sapphireglobalfs.com. Sapphire Global is an authorized financial services provider.
Freedom Stationery supply Marlin and Marlin Kids pens to me and my school friends. They supply just about everything we need to help us get a better education, from books to files to rulers. In fact, any any accessory we need. Freedom Stationery. Education for the nation. What does accessory mean?
Salam Media, your spiritual companion this Ramadan.
It's exactly 10 minutes to 6 p.m. Welcome back. If you've just tuned in, you are listening to the weekend edition of the Iftar Drive on Salam Media with myself, Zahid Jadwit. Of course, we are continuing our conversation about digital IDs, and our guest this afternoon, Professor Keith Breckenridge, historian at the University of Witwatersrand and author of the book Biometric State, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa, 1850 to the present. Professor, thank you so much for holding on while we took ads. Now, continuing with our conversation and building on what we discussed earlier on, when we are speaking about digital ID in South Africa, I know you said you cautioned against looking at it from a privacy lens, and I'm hoping you can maybe just go a bit deeper into that and share with us why do you think so?
Well, there are lots of reasons. There's some of the societies that have the richest, what we will call general prosperity, welfare for everybody, are the ones that make the most basic kind of identifying information very widely available. So, the Scandinavian countries put your name, your address, your ID number up on the database. They put your tax up on the database, publicly available. It's a little bit restricted, but it's generally available. I think those things are all very helpful. I think that's how you can actually produce a kind of more prosperous society. I think the idea of what privacy really is it's a kind of modern, really late 20th century, post-Second World War, fear of the state, where people are worried about the state, but they don't ask any of these questions about Zuckerberg and Facebook, and they use WhatsApp for everything. They expose themselves to these incredibly powerful international, actually, monopoly firms that are, I think, really very destructive, blowing up the world. The problem with a digital ID system is not that it's going to suddenly make our privacy more at risk. It's much more likely that it's just going to be wrong, that it'll be very hard to fix. That's the real worry. So I think the arguments about privacy they're really misplaced, and they come from people who don't know much about where privacy comes from, and how, until the Second World War, everybody was living in houses they didn't have separate bedrooms. They were living with their multi-generations. They didn't have a means of separating themselves in a way that would really make privacy real. And if you go back any further, most societies are incredibly invasive of your privacy. That means that the priest in Europe or in England was watching to see, how many times they were attending church, how many drinks they had in a pub, who they were having sex with. That kind of knowledge is very well known in most human societies. So trying to get into an argument about privacy in a time when we have the internet and this massive machine hoovering up all of our information I'm afraid, it's a kind of red herring, taking us. It's foolish, I'm afraid. That's the only way I can really say this. And so I think the risk that you're worrying about, Zahid, is the security problem. It's someone builds up this big, powerful database, and then they don't look after it, and someone hacks into it and exposes all of us, and some of that information can be very damaging. But I wouldn't understand that. I wouldn't try and analyze it through the lens of privacy. I think it's much more. It's, you need really careful design, and you need not to make it easy for people to find out how much money you've got in your bank account. Perhaps not you, but the people I'm most worried about are old people. I'm worried that they are the ones who are going to be at risk in this. And I don't think that's because the state's going to collect ID numbers. We have all of that already. We have this thing called Harness, the Home Affairs National Information System. It's complete. Everybody's data is inside this old database. The database dates from actually the late 1990s. It should have been long ago. It should have been really rehabilitated. And the key thing that they need to do with it is to track who accesses it. So you can't have a situation which we currently do of officials being able to basically interact with the database, look up things without the database necessarily being able to track who's using it. So that's what worries me. It's the surveillance needs to be richer and more three-dimensional, and it needs to track the officials, the people who are, and I'd like to see that for everything, truly. I'd like to see all bank account information monitored in the same way. So if someone's looking at what your bank balance is, the supervisors get a report. And so when 2 weeks later, you phone and you say, someone's trying to break into my account, they've told me they represent the bank, that information needs to be really carefully gathered and used. So in a way, I'm afraid I'm saying that privacy actually might be the problem. Imagining things as problems being solved through the privacy lens, especially in a context when Google and Facebook and everybody else are gathering, gobbling up all the information and then selling it. Let's not pretend, that's what they do. That is their business model. They sell $200 billion worth of intelligence about all of us to advertising companies. It's not sensible to be thinking that somehow we're going to be able to impose a privacy limit on Home Affairs and hope that will work. It just isn't the right way to think about the problem.
Yeah.
Tell me why you don't agree, Zaid. Come on.
Well, I've had my journey through the privacy discussion. I think it was last year, somewhere around August. I read this book. I'm trying to remember the name. It was, I think it was called The Right to Oblivion. And I think I'm not sure if you've heard of this book, but once in a while I read a book and it really shifts the way I think about things. And privacy really, the book was, it was quite a deep exploration of the concept. And I think it shifted how I thought about privacy. And I think we generally think about privacy as from the security lens, but this then shifts it and goes a bit deeper. And I think the listeners who might be interested in that book can go and find that book on the internet at the nearest bookshop also, and maybe take a closer look at it. But it's fascinating because it also made me rethink how I interact with the different digital tools that we have. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, all of these social media applications and platforms. There are so many, and it's shocking how much we voluntarily just hand over and allow them to profit off our information. So quite interesting. And unfortunately, I don't think we really have enough time to actually go into the nitty-gritty of the privacy debate as much as I would have liked to do so. But just to come back to our conversation here about digital IDs, you've looked into this for quite some time, and you mentioned some of the other models, India, Estonia, and the way you see South Africa's rollout at the moment of this digital ID system, what are some of the lessons or experiences from other countries that you think we should be looking at and paying attention to right now?
So I said this earlier, but the absolutely critical thing is what you could call kind of legitimate intermediaries, people that the state recognizes as having the power to help you solve problems. So this could involve privacy. This could be, your information is being leaked and somebody's using it, and you then could go to see a lawyer who will help you solve that problem. And in Rwanda, one of our students, Fatima Mullah, is working on their land registration, titling, and mortgaging systems. And what drives that are private notaries, people who are paid a small fee to assist people with basically correcting or doing transactions correctly. And if you look at how this works in France and in Germany, it's the notaries. They get paid a fortune, but notaries are private professionals that basically help keep all of the data correct. And we have notaries in South Africa. We hardly use them. We only really use them for prenuptial contracts. But we have a lot of people trained in the law. And I would say what we need the state to do is something like what we do with undertakers. We need to literally empower tens of thousands of people as licensed, essentially data brokers who can help people fix the data that the state has. And they need to have privileged access to the state systems. That doesn't mean they need to be able to edit the database. They really just need to be able to query and interact with an official who will listen to them. At the moment, one of the serious problems in South Africa, the two serious problems, the first one is there's a suspicion of intermediaries. So if a lawyer writes to somebody at Home Affairs, they often don't get a reply over literally years. It can take a decade before they get a response from the officials at Home Affairs. And the other problem is that the officials are all talking to each other on WhatsApp. So there's this kind of hidden domain in which the decision making is taking place, and you can't really find out, and you can't get a remedy unless you can inject your query into that kind of WhatsApp world. And those are both very serious problems. And the only way to fix that is to create private interests who paid a small amount. Sometimes, it could be a couple of $1,000 to fix the problems that people are going to have. They're going to be really serious problems. Children that are named in the wrong family. And until we figure out what the layer of correcting all of that is, we're really going to be in, I think, really serious trouble. Or, much more likely, it just will not work. I mean, that's what we had before. This idea of the dynamic digital ID in South Africa dates to the late 1960s when IBM promised us, you're too young for this, I bet speak to your parents. This thing called the Book of Life. It was going to be dynamically updated. It was going to be your educational history in the database. Your address was going to be updated, all of that information. It was a complete catastrophe. By the end of the 1970s, they were begging people to stop applying for the Book of Life because they couldn't actually implement it. And the state again thinks it's going to stand up and it's going to take on this massive task of gathering all the information from everybody and then essentially trying to fix it when they discover how much of it is incorrect. So that's and if you look at the countries, even in India, the key thing is what we would call intermediaries, the people who basically are paid a fee to help people. And even in places like Nigeria and Ethiopia, it's these delegated private intermediaries that are helping these states build the databases. They don't do a good job because they're both similar to us, have these very authoritarian states. They don't do a good job of empowering those people to essentially help fix the problems.
All right, we've gone 2 minutes over time. Just looking forward, your final thoughts?
My final thoughts. So this is a global, this transformation that's happening. It's not only us. It's happening in every single country. There are a couple, even the British tried, you'll have noticed this, Starmer announced we're going to go with digital ID. And then when he realized how unpopular that is in England, in Britain, he abandoned it or said it would be voluntary. Something like this is in place in the European Union now as well. So we're going to have to do it. And I think we really just need to help, particularly the people. Home Affairs is the core of this. And one of the big problems with the way the digital ID scheme is being driven is that Home Affairs is not centered in the discussion. It's often ignored completely. So we really need Home Affairs to come out and to be, I'm afraid, much more confident and trusting of especially what we call civil society, the private interests that exists, and to massively extend the pool of intermediaries that they think of as kind of trusted people who can do the work of helping them fix how the database works.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Professor Keith Breckenridge, historian at the University of the Witwatersrand. He's also the author of the book Biometric State, The Global Politics of Identification and Surveillance in South Africa, 1850 to the present. And I think he gave us he took us on a journey through the historical background of digital IDs, something you're going to hear about a lot more in the year ahead as the government attempts to roll out a digital ID system in South Africa. And that brings us to 4 minutes past 6 p.m. We've still got a lecture coming up. And this one is actually the conquest of Jerusalem, how the Bedouins destroyed the world's largest army. It's part of a Ramadan series by Sheikh Yasser Qadi. That's coming up after this ad break, and then we'll come back and wrap up as we head closer to iftar. Please stay with us.